Hello everyone, how's life? So welcome back to another one of my book review videos, and in this edition I wanted to kick off with this work by Amin Maalouf called Leo the African. Now Leo the African is essentially historical fiction, so much of the contents aren't actually true, but it is based on a real life person who was a real life explorer during the 16th century known as Leo the African or Leo Africanus, whose real name was Hassan al-Wazan. Now, Leo the African is written as a diary from the titular character, and it basically documents his life exploring the many places that the individual traveled to. Now, it places the character in famous events that occurred during his lifetime, which in real life he may or may not have actually participated in or witnessed. A bit like, Forrest Gump, with having Leo the African placed in famous events that allow us to get a first-hand feel of them that occurred, obviously, in the 16th century. Now, as it's written as a diary, I was able to essentially enjoy one diary entry here on one day, another day, maybe 5 portions in one day if I had enough time, because I didn't really have that much time. And I was able to enjoy the book in short, sweet segments. And it was a really fascinating book. I really enjoyed it. It was brilliantly written, so entertaining. It really has that kind of Arabian Nights feel. The Bedouins with the swords, the palaces in the middle of the deserts, the slave girls. You can visualize everything in your head. It's really entertainingly written. And I don't really know much about the author, but you have to give the author credit for being able to capture the lingo, the culture, and the mindset of the Muslims at that time. Because one of the things I noticed when it comes to many books on the Islamic world, Orientalist books, or even movies, is that they get so many things wrong, even small little things which wouldn't bother other people, but I noticed. Like, for example, in the 2010 film Predators, where somebody is a Muslim character is praying one of their 5 daily prayers. Now, Muslims pray in the direction of the Kaaba, which is in Mecca in Saudi Arabia. So where was this character praying if he was literally on another planet? So yeah, it's just little things like that which kind of grind my bones sometimes, highlighting that the people, the filmmakers or the book writers didn't do their research. But this is fantastically researched. It's so on the nose. Like, somebody would have to literally research the theology of the religion in order to actually come up with the characters that are in this book. But anyway, Leo the African is a really, really entertaining book that first of all covers the individual escaping from the Christian Inquisition in Spain, Al-Andalusia. For those who don't know, Spain was essentially a Muslim country for around 700 years, and the Christians took over. And then slowly, the Muslim and Jewish population began either being eradicated or forced to convert to Christianity. And so he was a child during that time. And the Book of Granada is mainly told through his father, telling Hassan al-Wazan the story of the fall of Granada and all the interesting stories that come around with that. Then you essentially have the character journeying to the east as a merchant, so he meets very interesting characters in the desert and different sultans and kings of this district or that area. And then the exotic story ends up in the middle of the Ottoman Empire. So Selim the Grim, who is a real life Ottoman sultan, he is one of the many real life characters that exist in the book. And from the world of the Ottomans, he ends up being kidnapped and ends up in Rome. So there's many different places covered, many funny little micro stories, and overall it's a fantastic, very entertaining piece of work. I felt the first half was the strongest because it had a kind of childlike innocence, because Leo the African is a teenager and he's growing up and he's learning things, and there's a kind of coming of age feel about the book. And there's loads of really entertaining stuff. Like, for example, there's one story where he gets married, and the tradition of the culture that he lives in is that the husband and wife, they go to the bedroom, they do their thing, and the blood on the cloth is proof of the woman's chastity. But she walks into the room and he's there, and he can see that she's a bit nervous, and he's trying to console her, all of that kind of stuff. But she literally faints, and everybody's waiting outside, and he's thinking, how on earth am I supposed to get her to wake up so we can do this? Everybody's waiting. And it ends up going in a really funny, crazy place. But it's such a great, entertaining book. What I meant about the first half being the most entertaining is that in the second half, he ends up marrying a woman who has a child, with a child from a previous marriage, and he is a threat in terms of lineage to the current Ottoman Sultan. So it ends up becoming some kind of espionage novel where they have to travel through different districts and stuff to get away from people who may try and kill the child. So it started to get a bit different. And when the character is kidnapped in the third quarter of the book and ends up traveling to Italy, and then learns the culture of the Italian Romans and the Catholic Church and Catholicism, and meets with the Pope, all of that kind of stuff. That part, unfortunately, I felt was a bit boring. That's where the book got kind of dry and dull, and I was kind of counting the pages until it finished. It's just a case of the politics in the Catholic Church was probably the least interesting bit about the book, and there was a lot of really complex Italian names that were hard to follow, like who is who, like which party is against which party, and who's fighting who, and who wants to take over, and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, a very entertaining book. Good if you want, like I said, a book that has that kind of Arabian Nights feel, but one that takes place in many different places. So you've got that bonus. Like, for example, obviously it takes place in Italy, it takes place in Al-Andalusia, which is Muslim Spain, and Egypt, and many other places. And there's so many great anecdotes and stories, some which will be true, many which will not be, but it was a very entertaining piece of work. So the second book, and I'm sticking with a bit of a theme in this video, the second book is actually a true story. It's essentially a diary. This is Desert Encounter by Nud Holmlow. I think that's how you pronounce it. This is also a diary, but this is a real life diary, so this is not a piece of fiction. This is a book written by the Danish journalist Holmlow, who traveled throughout North Africa while North Africa was under colonial rule from the Italians, mainly Libya. Now, Holmlow's diary, it starts off quite, innocently. It's very standard, so-so. I was kind of thinking, why is this considered such a great book? It's just a guy traveling across the desert with one or two companions. It's nice. It has that kind of nice kind of travel book feel. And the car breaks down a few times, and they get into loads of different adventures. They meet a few interesting characters along the way. But then about halfway through, it becomes really, really heavy, really emotional. And I was holding back tears reading this. And to think that all of the stuff in this book is true is insane. So he essentially meets loads of random colorful characters, but one of the important things to note is that he meets Italian military officials who explain to him that he, by the way, is obviously a European, but he actually converted to Islam before he traveled, before he made this journey. So he was a Muslim, but many people who he encountered weren't aware that he was a Muslim. So he had that European insight, so to speak, where people would treat him differently. If he's wearing his European clothing, and if he decides to put on some Arab clothing, they will treat him differently. So he sees different sides. It's a very unbiased work in the sense that he's honest in the fact that there's Bedouin people he meets who he feels were, less than nice people, and Italian officials who he meets who he thinks were very good people. But the overall gist is that these Italian officers that he meets, they talk about how the Arabs are animals and all that kind of stuff, and we've come to civilize them. And an image is built of the fact that these people who are in the desert fighting for control of their country are, depraved lunatics because of his encounters with the army officials. But then eventually, about halfway through, he actually gets kidnapped by the natives, dances with wolf style, and then he learns their ways and their cultures and hears stories from them. Really sad stuff, which highlights their mentality and why they're fighting this fight and why they will not back down even though they're starving. They're completely outnumbered by the Italians. The Italians have tanks and guns while they have stones and things. Like there's one tribal leader who talks to the author, who talks about how he was out and when he got home, his son, who he loved dearly, had been murdered, and his daughter, who also he loved dearly, had been kidnapped by the Italians, and he tracked her down and he found her at some brothel where she was forced to work, and she was so heartbroken and devastated, and he couldn't take her out of there, and she begged him to kill her, and he did. And it's amazing, it's incredible, the things. That's just one of many examples of this. It's so sad, but it's a very important book as well, because it was straight away banned in Italy, and obviously the Italian government, I believe in the 50s, they destroyed all the, or at least most of the records of the oppression that was committed by the Italian government and Italian military in Libya. So this is one of the few actual authentic works we have on the ground floor by an unbiased author who was there traveling, not writing about it from England or Denmark or whatever, but right there on the ground floor, traveling around the place and talking to people on all sides. And as such, it's a very, very important work. He actually gets imprisoned and tortured by the Italians himself. And shortly after the book was released, the author was actually murdered, and his death was shrouded in mystery. Some say he was murdered by the Italian Secret Service, but who knows. All in all, this is a very, very heavy book, a very important book, one that, like I said, starts off as a typical travel book, but then goes into some really heavy places, and it ends up as something that is just so sad and a part of European history that is really important, that is often not talked about and covered up and hidden under the carpet, as is much of Europe's colonial history in the Middle East and Africa. So yeah, a very, very fantastic work. One where he documents, as the book says, people who are gassed and starved out of their villages, people herded into concentration camps. He witnesses horrifying things, and he witnesses also the resolve of these individuals, these Sufis who live on hardly anything but just trust in their God. And interestingly, Omar Mukhtar is mentioned a lot. Omar Mukhtar is the Libyan freedom fighter who spent about 70 years of his life fighting the Italians, and he was eventually captured and executed. His life is documented in the movie The Lion of the Desert, which is a really great film. And I think much of the information, not all of it, but certain anecdotes from Lion of the Desert are actually taken directly from here, I believe, because there's some things, like for example, there's one part where the Italians are chasing Omar Mukhtar. Omar Mukhtar, his horse is shot, he falls off, and a youngster gives him his horse so he can get away, and the youngster is taken by the Italians, and then he is eventually executed. That actually happens in the movie, and it happens in here, and I think maybe they got it from here, but in any case, this is a really, really good work, and I would recommend this to anyone. So going back to a book like Leo the African, one that is drenched in real life history but is ultimately a work of fiction, I really enjoyed this work, Shadow of the Pomegranate Tree by Tariq Ali. So like the first chapter or so of Leo the African covers the fall of Granada, this book is also set after the fall of Granada. So the backdrop is you have this rich family called the Banu Hudayl clan, and they live in this village in Al-Andalusia, Muslim Spain, which has recently been taken over by the Christians, and they've burnt loads of Muslim books. Now their family has lived there for hundreds and hundreds of years, but there's rumors that the Christians are forcing people to convert. There's whispers that Jews and Muslims are being systematically wiped out, and these whispers are getting greater and greater and greater, and eventually that drama and trouble brings itself to the Banu Hudayl door, and we go from there. But that's the backdrop of the book, the fall of Granada, and that stuff does end up happening in the book. There's a lot of violence, a lot of really sad stuff that happens. The ending is very heavy, it's very, very emotional, but for most of it, it's essentially just a kind of family drama, a really interesting family drama. These people, it's one of those where the younger generation learn of family secrets of the older generation. Sometimes it gets into kind of melodrama, like this character was sleeping with that character, all of that kind of stuff. It did go a little bit far in places. I mentioned in I think I've got an individual review of this on my channel, and I mentioned that the author seemed a little bit sex obsessed, but it's not enough to detract from the overall work. And again, this is a book like Leo the African that has that kind of wonderful romanticized feel of the old days of the Islamic world. And again, it's not obviously a complete work of fiction. There's real life characters in this. It's the overall gist of it, the backdrop, the fall of Granada, as mentioned, is something that really happened. I'm not sure if the Banu Hudayl clan are real people, but their kind of family conflicts and troubles are covered in great detail. And this is, the family tree, which is very necessary because there's so many characters in the family, and you do have to kind of come back and refer to this many times throughout the book. But a really wonderful, entertaining family drama for most of it, with this kind of sinister feel, this aroma that something really bad is going to happen because of the whispers that the Christians are committing atrocities, and those atrocities are getting closer and closer to where the Banu Hudayl family live, and then eventually they do hit the Banu Hudayl family. I really enjoyed this work, and I enjoyed it so much that I ended up buying another book by the same author called The Stone Woman, and this one I thought was absolutely terrible. It says here as inventive and fantastical as the Arabian Nights, but I mean, I've read the Arabian Nights. I've got a review of that on the channel as well. But this book is really poor. All of the complaints I have about Shadow of the Pomegranate Tree, like the fact that the author may be kind of putting a little bit of his own political agenda into the characters, and the characters don't really feel like they belong in that time period. Some of the things that they say and do, or the obsession with sex and people sleeping around. Like I said, it was kept to a minimum in that book, but it just goes crazy with this one. This book is literally everybody trying to sleep with each other, people acting like feminists and liberal secularists, when the book is set in early 20th century during the fall of the Ottoman Empire, with a rich Turkish family in 1899, while the empire is crumbling and there's a strong suggestion that it will end up being destroyed. Now that sounds very interesting. Just like with Shadow of a Pomegranate Tree, it's set against the backdrop of a turbulent time in Islamic history, and there's a rich family full of very colorful characters. But this one is just so weird. It's like, let me give you an example. There's two openly gay characters who are very open with each other in one of the characters' father's home. There's a woman who talks to her own brother about how she cheated on her husband, and he says, "Oh, just do whatever you love doing." And it's also really weird, It's like people wouldn't act like this in that time and place, you don't think? And it's just a case of, it's almost like the author's fantasy about what he wishes people were like, but the reality is that people were not like this. And so it's unfortunate, because it's a book that could have been really good, but it just feels like he went off the rails and the author lost the plot with it. Again, there is an individual review I have of this on the channel, where I go into much more detail. But yeah, so those are 4 interesting books, each of them related in some ways, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching. Subscribe for more, and goodbye.